landscaping. But then I thought, no, that's too cruel. That's just too cruel. I thought I would speak to you about some of the highlights of book reviews that I've been doing. I do a book a month for 21stcr.org. Usually they're theological books. Very occasionally one sneaks in, which isn't. And I come across a lot of gems in doing this. One gem I came across is this: if you don't read, what advantage have you over those who can't read? And another gem I found is this: all truth passes through 3 stages. This is from a German philosopher. First stage, it is ridiculed. Second, it is violently opposed. And third, it is accepted as being self-evident. Unfortunately, I think we're still between 1 and 2 on that scale. I'm more than aware, by the way, that few people are actually reading these days. But it's a mistake not to associate books with technology, because, you know, Lumosity, the neuroscience research company, they do online brain training and so on. They show that there is a very notable difference in the brain, in brainwave activity, when you read a book critically as opposed to just reading. You do yourself a real favor when you read critically. All the neurons are flashing and beeping. Your brain scan shows a great deal of activity and it actually shows increased blood flow. It's like turning your brain on. If you're not reading critically, all this activity plummets. The same is true for audio tapes. And so there seems to be no detour to the real hard grind of real application. I wish there were. I listen to a lot of audio tapes in the garden. In fact, someone once asked me, why did I have only one earphone? I said, look, I pruned the other one off. And I cannot tell you how many sets of headphones I've been through by pruning them off. But again, hour for hour, just listening does not cut it. And if you were to consider TV watching, forget it. Actually, it puts you very solidly in the red. Atlanta's famous choral conductor, Robert Shaw, was the son of a Baptist minister, but he said that he would not darken the door of the church because you had to check your brain at the door. Nowhere is critical thinking, of course, more needed than in church. The spin should stop here. Believing in a false narrative is very dangerous. And Mark Twain said this: do you know that it's easier to fool someone than to convince someone that they have been fooled? So first, let me tell you about a book that I have not reviewed, but it's one that's received some of the most amazing reviews and testimonials I've ever heard. It's called Lies My Teacher Told Me. Author is James Lowen. It's received all kind of book awards, and in fact, it's been used as a college textbook. Don't drift off when I mention textbook, because I can tell you that several people have testified that they've stayed up all night reading it. This book is a plea for truth in education. It asserts that we have lost touch with our history. It's an analysis and critique of how mainstream high school textbooks teach American history. But it appears that much of what has been taught is historical mythology, well-established lies. I heard somewhere the phrase informational kudzu. That's how I would apply it. You know that kudzu can grow a foot a day. Let me just note some of the things that readers have said about this book. I learned more in this book than I did in 4 years of history. Nothing is the way you think it is. This is an epiphany book, the single most enlightening book I have ever read. This is the best intellectual exercise I have had in years. And finally, the most powerful thing I can say about this book is that when you look up from it, the world, past and present, looks different. In the book club to which I belong, a former teacher opened our session by saying how dreadfully sorry she was. She actually, for 40 years, taught, she said, the very same lies outlined in this book. And she was dreadfully sorry. She said, I just didn't know. I was galvanized by this statement. It would be better not to know so many things than to know so many things that were not so. The author submits that almost everything in the traditional accounts is either wrong or unverifiable. If you were to look at just some of the examples of the names of our history textbooks, Triumph of the American Nation, The American Pageant, Land of Promise, and so on and on. By contrast, our chemistry and civics books, with them about as exciting as you can get would be Principles of Chemistry. We do not have textbooks entitled The Triumph of the Molecule. So his premise is that textbooks actually make students stupid, that our society lies to itself about its past, and he attributes this to nationalism. The heroification of characters offers no way of learning from their mistakes. Blemishes are selectively omitted. We are prevented from learning the truth. History is written as a celebration, robbing history of life and meaning, being a record of what people did and not what they failed to do. I don't agree with everything in the book, but it's certainly a good read and a wonderful challenge. As a medical school professor said, as research advances, about half of what we will teach over the next 4 years will turn out to be wrong. The problem is we don't know which half. But one area of knowledge that will never become outdated is the capacity to evaluate critically, always. And he says this, ignorance is a disease, knowledge is the cure, and education is the treatment. So, one of the most stunning books that I have reviewed is called Jesus Wars. Please listen carefully to the subtitle. How 4 patriarchs, 3 queens, and 2 emperors decided what Christians would believe for the next 1,500 years. Author Philip Jenkins. This is not the American way to give away our say, and yet this is what happened because we don't know what happened. The author says this, what ultimately became accepted as Christian orthodoxy was hammered out in a process that was painfully slow, gradual, and often bloody. The conflict was marked by repeated struggles, coups, and open warfare. I said this, the author tells us that the decision as to who were the heretics might just as well have been made by saying eeny, meeny, miny, mo, or by tossing a coin. Here's the real grabber. There was a time when the two-nature or God-man description of Jesus was a heresy. Sometimes the guys who believed this were in, and sometimes they were out, and the likes of us were in. Winners are grinners, rules again. But if we do not understand that what was once regarded as heretical nonsense became the bedrock of the Christian church, then we are at risk and in grave danger of accepting non-biblical substitutions for truth. There was even the tiniest little bit of humor here. The author feels that the course of history depended not just on one man and his vote, or who was in power, but on one horse. The horse of Emperor Theodosius stumbled, killing the emperor. Jenkins thinks that if he had lived, he might well have reigned another 20 years, and the outcome might have been quite different. And again, just a mere touch of humor. Jenkins actually tells us, well, he describes the dramas that occurred in the Jesus Wars. Bishops were on again, off again. There was even an illness known as Vicar of Bray syndrome. So what was that? It was simply the urge to keep one's job at whatever cost. Each settlement was fragile, defections occurring whenever they dared, and anathemas being hurled by the victors. And here is the very somber summary the author makes. These ideas triumphed not because of the force of their logic or by scriptural truth, but because the world that opposed them perished. And of course it didn't perish without some help. For me, Jenkins' most stunning insight was this. I have it in bold on my paper. It's hard not to shout it. He says that the church councils responsible for the present-day creeds remade a faith. They remade a faith. So please imagine this scene with me. This scene describes ordinary people, ordinary rank and file, but so involved in theological issues relating to God and Jesus that this was the scene back then. Every part of the city is filled with such talk. The alleys, the crossroads, the squares, the avenues. It comes from those who sell clothes, money changers, grocers. If you ask a money changer what the exchange rate is, he will reply with a dissertation on the begotten and the unbegotten. If you inquire the price of bread, the baker will reply, the Father is greater, and the Son subject to him. When you ask at the baths whether the water is ready, the manager will declare that the Son came forth from nothing. By contrast, here is the situation today. The churches officially follow Chalcedon in preaching a Christ in two natures, and they unabashedly worship God lying in the manger. I can only think how far we have fallen, and I'm mindful of the book, The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind. And the author says that the scandal is that there is not much of an evangelical mind. So, were these people who forged your theology, were they worthy to have made such a choice for you? I leave that for your investigation. Were they godly men or rogues and villains? I move now to a book by Dallas Willard, Divine Conspiracy. He says it is the failure to understand Jesus and his words that explains why we do not teach people how to do what he said was best. He says that there's a stranglehold of ideas and concepts that shunt Jesus aside, that intelligence is currently obstructed by clouds of well-intentioned misinformation. That's the same theme I began with. Professor Willard notes that we have substituted for religious belief many other practices, social ethics, some morally upright ideas, but we attach to them religious language. What a brilliant insight it is when he says that we settle into de facto alienation of our religion from Jesus. And in fact, he calls this chapter the case of the missing teacher, the absence of Jesus as teacher. And this, he says, is the gospel of the current Christian left. Love comes out on top. And of the current Christian right, he dramatically describes their message, a gospel of sin management. He's noted for his beautiful writing, and so I'll just finish with this. I think you will see why he has that wonderful reputation. A human life or a human world is one that holds together in terms of the future. It essentially involves meaning. Meaning is not a luxury for us. It is a kind of spiritual oxygen, we might say, that enables our souls to live. The meaning of present events in human life is largely a matter of what comes later. From Jesus, we learn of the ultimate context, God and his kingdom. And by the way, he says that what makes a genius is the ability to recognize the obvious. I found that very, very interesting. And with regard to our ever-increasing biblical illiteracy, note this. A New York Times and Washington there are two people here. A New York Times and a Washington Post reporters, I should say, were having lunch and betting on who knows more about Christianity. Mr. New York Times says, "I'll bet you $20 that you can't say the Lord's Prayer." Ms. Washington Post says, "You're on." She bows her head and says, "Now I lay me down to sleep." Mr. New York Times hands her $20 saying, "That's impressive. I didn't think you knew it." I once reviewed a book that I considered really awful. I won't even mention the author's name, but I did it in the hope that it might make people think. Jogging someone into thinking is actually one of the greatest gifts you could give to someone. Deceit flourishes without critical thinking, and so to bless someone by challenging the status quo is to open their eyes to a new world. The awful book in question is called When God Prays. Just think of all the people who would have been involved in getting that book to press. Proofreaders, editors, copyright specialists, publishers, printers. Did no one ever say, "Hang on, who would he pray to?" And all the other impossibilities involved. I reviewed this, hoping that just one person would think. And I said this: praying is a very serious activity. One needs to know to whom one is praying. To pray is not to be God. It is to seek God. We are being asked in this book to believe that one God is praying to another. But the author says we pray for spiritual strength, to be fortified and to be edified. So he has one God who is not spiritually strong, fortified, or edified, praying to the one who is. He says we have one God trying to deepen the relationship with another. I found this a tragedy of gigantic proportions. Words misused corrupt the thinking. They mess with our heads. On the back cover of this book, it says that Jesus demonstrated his dependence on the Father by spending time in prayer. But he says in John 17 that Jesus demonstrates his omniscience. I included in my review of this book 71 points which a Bible student wrote entitled, "If Jesus is God, what does this say about God?" Examples of her 71 points are these: God was forsaken by God. God was baptized to fulfill all righteousness. God was the first fruits of human resurrection. God approved of God. I'm adding to this list all the time. It's about up to 80 now. Thinking is still allowed. Yes, we have thought police, but generally thinking is still allowed. I wrote to the Billy Graham Association because they recommended this book, and I wanted to be fair to them and understand the mindset of an organization that could support this book. This is the answer I received. It is often perplexing to note that Jesus addresses God in prayer. The answer is this: Jesus was a true man as well as God. He is described by theologians, note theologians, as one divine person having two natures. In all of this great mystery, we have only glimmers of truth, which are beyond human comprehension. So, note that they say he's described by theologians in this manner. And of course they play the mystery card, but how am I to assent to what is incomprehensible? Isn't it tragic that God is not clever enough to create the human race with enough intelligence to know who he is? I wrote back asking for some scriptural references, and they wrote back, we are unable to offer further counsel, and I was urged to seek the advice of my pastor. I did. The agony of doing this review did pay off for me, because someone in Switzerland saw it and wrote to me asking for permission to translate it into German. And I was able to put him into contact with a fellow truth seeker in Switzerland and a colleague in Austria. Let me switch now to another treasure which I've found. I haven't reviewed this because it's already been reviewed several times. The book is in fact called Switch. It's a book about change, about how to change things when change is hard. Authors Chip and Dan Heath. It's a book about success and failure and about reality, but using psychology. It's a book about, actually, it's mostly a book about surprises. It's counterintuitive. One of the success stories based on the principles in this book is the term designated driver. You may have thought it was always a part of our vocabulary, but not so. In 1998, there was a campaign launched to make this a very familiar term. And we have it. It was started purposely, started small, but it's spread massively, and of course has saved lives and become a part of our culture. This book is full of true stories. I'll tell you just one of my favorites. Jerry Sternin worked for an international organization called Save the Children. He was invited by the Vietnamese government to solve the problem of malnutrition among the children. But he had minimum resources, was given only 6 months to make a difference. He didn't speak a word of Vietnamese. He had read about the problem, and this is what he faced: universal poverty, poor sanitation, clean water not readily available, and much ignorance about nutrition. What he did know was this, that if he had to deal with poverty, there wasn't a hope he could make a difference in 6 months. What he did do was this. He went into the country's villages and talked to the mothers. He measured and weighed each child. Then he asked the mothers this: did you find any poor kids who are bigger and healthier than the average? Oh yes, said the mothers. He immediately said, let's go and see what they are doing. This guy might have spent 20 years in this country if he had tried to analyze this problem in another way. But this is the first principle from the Switch book. Follow the bright spots. Investigate what's working and clone it. Ask what's working and how can we do more of it. The bright spot, those flashes of success, can illuminate the roadmap for action and spark the hope that change is possible. One other very important principle from the book: success, as outlined here, cannot tolerate any kind of ambivalence or ambiguity. It's got to be a crystal clear message, and the clarity of that message is what forms the framework for action. So I don't want to leave you in suspense. Let me just tell you very quickly what Jerry Sternin did. The Bright Spot mothers they were feeding their children in a little different way. They were collecting shrimp and crabs from the rice paddies and mixing them in with the kids' rice. Shrimp and crabs were eaten by adults, but generally they weren't considered to be food for children. The mothers also tossed in sweet potato greens. They were considered a very low-class food. But these dietary improvisations, however strange or low class, were doing something precious, adding sorely needed nutrition and protein to the children's diet. And this is all it took. So he set up a series of classes where the bright spot mothers taught the other mothers. It was a huge, huge success. Oh, how I love clear, to-the-point sentences. Sometimes in writing these reviews, I find it necessary to read a sentence multiple times to see what's being said, and sometimes I still don't know. Sometimes I want to tear my hair out in frustration. Let me give you a few examples. Writers like to write like this for some very odd reason. It is excessively difficult to avoid the conclusion that, and then the sentence goes on for another 40 words. Or in short, it is hardly possible to avoid giving an affirmative answer to the question that, blah, blah, blah. Sometimes it's necessary even to translate our own language, because in England, if you could read in a British newspaper that Jones is helping police with inquiries, then you could think, that's nice of Jones. Oh no, that means that Jones has been arrested. Or you could hear this: Smith has difficulty in distinguishing between his own and others' property. He's a thief. British theologians and their students seem to be awfully like tennis players who put so much spin on the ball or on the word that they dazzle their opponent or reader. In fact, I dare say that they put some English on their words before they hurl them at us. But the spin really does need to stop here in order to get to the truth. Truth slides or is shrouded or is overwritten, bedazzled. I do try, sometimes desperately, to get readers to see that all is not well. I view this as an imperative, and I'm not sure that truth can either be taught or even recognized without seeing or admitting the false version. A reinforcement of this is that people are not always willing to consider a new option until they see the faults of the old one. I have schooled myself to look out for what I call weasel words. These are simply cautionary words which can be innocent, but they can hide what is going on. Sort of like sleight of hand, as in card tricks, only this is sleight of mouth. Here are some of these words: compromise, abandoned, redefinition, expansive, expansion, appending, additional, drift, rift, departure, adaptation, development, shift, parting, mutation. One author used this word, mutation, as meaning a good thing. But Webster's tells us that the new organism resulting from a mutation is different from its parents. So I have to ask, good thing or bad thing? My next and final author is Chinese. Thankfully, he writes beautifully. Eric Chang is the author of The One True God. He died fairly recently. I regret that because I would have loved to have met him. I admire his honesty and clear-sightedness. He was a Trinitarian pastor for 40 years, over. And please note this true story, because it's quite remarkable. While still a Trinitarian, Pastor Chang was very sincerely pondering the question of how to get the gospel to Muslims. He came to the full realization that it couldn't be done. And of course, there are exceptions. Why could it not be done? Why not? Because Muslims, or Jews for that matter, cannot and will not. That is, they are unable to hear the gospel because it does not come from a foundation of monotheism. And that insight is what put him on the path to investigating the Trinity. He's a very, very bold man. He says this: where there is belief in more than one person who is God, that is polytheism by definition. The fundamental problem created by elevating Jesus to the level of deity is that a situation is created in which there are at least two persons who are both equally God. This brings Trinitarianism into conflict with the monotheism of the Bible. And note what he said here. He makes a brilliant point, I think. He explains that in India, there are three gods more important than all the rest. He then asks this: if those in India who worship these three supreme gods are called polytheists by Christians, then in what way are the Christian Trinitarians any different? Remember, he had a foot in both camps, so he can speak to us very, very clearly. He said, but are Trinitarians not monotheists? As Trinitarians, we argue that we are monotheists, not polytheists, because our faith is in one God in three persons. We closed our eyes and ears to the fact which should have been perfectly obvious. If the Father is God and the Son is God, and the Spirit is God, and all three are co-equal and co-eternal, then the conclusion is inescapable, that there are three gods. So, how did we manage to maintain that we still believe in one God? There was only one way. The definition of the word God had to be changed from person to a divine substance or nature. So we've all heard a lot about junk science. Well, I think that Chang exposed some junk theology here. Sometimes just the book titles give the game away. Consider this: When Jesus Became God by Richard Rubinstein. In the book AD 381, historian Charles Freeman, who has no axe to grind, but he tells the same tale, that we are being fed a false narrative, an alternative narrative, he calls it. We must never march under the banner of a false narrative. And just one sentence from a booklet called, it was entitled The Impulse to Persecution. And I think this is just a good truth to have under one's belt. The church is persecuted. The church never persecutes. I think that we all ought to be in the life-saving business. I know that we all love to help where there are needs for food, money, and employment. But we should also regard as a ministry opportunity the opening of one's mind so as to think straight. To help someone to think straight, what an enormous blessing. And not surprisingly, the opening of one's mind sometimes comes as a result of recognizing what is not true. What a catalyst you could be with a few well-chosen comments or questions. This blesses both sides, as it can serve as the engine of motivation to deploy us into action. The understanding we receive from reading and from study is never meant to end there. This is not a selfish exercise, but a living opportunity. The whole point of gaining understanding would be to be able to pass it on. Sometimes this challenge to one's thinking is like the flicking of a switch, before and after. Perhaps it might be the greatest thing you could do for someone, because when you are thinking straight, you are much less likely to be deceived. And we all know that deception is the order of the day as we face future events. The giant needs fighting. Don't you want to have a part in this? As Reagan pleaded to tear down that wall, I am longing for the walls of ignorance to be torn down. If our worldview is skewed by a false or alternative narrative, then it is imperative that we know that. Ignorance is a grave sin. We cannot and must not promote ignorance, nor can we consent to deceit. So let's leave the Dark Ages behind and some of the monuments of human folly that were invented there. Let's do life on purpose and ask some hard questions, such as, did Christianity abandon paganism, or did it adopt it? The profound nature of Psalm 90:12 is one that drives me. Teach us to number our days, that we might present to you a heart of wisdom. That's an interesting commodity, as it were, that God is asking for. And don't you love it when you see something new, something quite new in the scriptures, something that you just never saw before? This is my New Living Translation of Romans 15:14. I am fully convinced, brothers and sisters, that you are full of goodness. Why were they full of goodness? You know these things so well that you are able to teach others all about